two short verses from Colossians chapter 3, verses 20 and 21. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. The psalmist tells us that children are a heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. That's Psalm 127. Some of you may know that my wife and I have 4 children, and it's true to say that every one of them has been a blessing to us. In varying degrees, they have the good features of their mother, and in other ways they display the bad features of their father. Just as wives and husbands can have ups and downs in their relationship, so can children and parents. And that's why Paul has instructions for them as well. I don't think that the Apostle Paul had a wife, although there are some scholars who insist that as a Pharisee he must have had at some stage. And he never refers to having had any natural children, although he did have the blessing of spiritual children such as Timothy and Titus, and we read about them in the letters that were addressed to them. But we shouldn't think that this means that his advice here is of no value. The Spirit of God has moved him to write the things that we read in these verses. The words that Paul writes in these verses are very similar to what he wrote in the first 4 verses of Ephesians chapter 6. Now, there are a number of Greek words which are translated as children in the New Testament. This is a regular word that is used here, which means offspring. It's not restricted to little children. It's not the word for sons either. So this applies right through to teenagers as well. In both Ephesians and in this passage, Paul writes, children, obey your parents. We read that in verse 20. The idea is quite simply, give ear to your parents. Parents are not perfect, but they do have something that children don't have just yet. They have experience and a better understanding of what is best. At least they should have. Listen to them, Paul says. Take their advice. Don't use the odd time that they might be wrong as a reason not to pay attention the most of the time when they're right. My parents are still alive and I still benefit from listening to them. In Ephesians, Paul writes that obedience is in the Lord. Here he writes, this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. It goes without saying that obedience to anyone is always subordinate to obedience to the Lord. The apostles said in Acts chapter 5, we ought to obey God rather than men. Pleasing the Lord is, of course, the key. I've often wondered why Paul does not then address parents. He does refer to them in verse 20. Here he addresses fathers. And maybe that's because fathers are more likely to fail and so need this exhortation all the more. It certainly underlines the influence that fathers can have upon their children for good or for ill. Paul writes, don't provoke your children, verse 21. Don't irritate them. Don't exasperate them. Don't be constantly down on them. That kind of behaviour, which we can easily fall into, can simply knock the heart out of children. They need a father's encouragement, and that is not a fault. It is something that we owe to our children. I don't mean indulgence and pampering, but rather wise counsel and encouragement. As Paul writes in Ephesians, the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So proper training is a very positive and upbuilding thing. I can tell you that these verses have been a challenge to me as a father, but I can also tell you that the next verses are a challenge as well.